Um, Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristi Stokes of the Greater Downtown Council, and it is a pleasure to at least see some of you today. We miss seeing you on a regular basis, so it's good to see some of your smiling faces, or at least see your names out there and know that you are with us. We are pleased to partner with the Minnesota Retailers Association this morning to provide you today's program, hoping to hopefully give you some additional insights on some best practices as we all work through this new way of doing business. And then we also look forward to sharing some new measures that the City of Duluth is taking to really help out our businesses as well. So Bruce Nustad from the Minnesota Retailers Association will share some of his expertise on our first segment of the session today. And then we'll hear from Fleege, the Director of Planning and Economic Development from the City of Duluth, about the resolution that was just passed by the City Council last night that will help some of our retailers as well as our restaurants as we go about this somewhat new normal for us. Some of you did share questions ahead of time before today's session, so we did pass those along, hoping that we can address some of those questions, but also know that there are some unknowns yet for some of us. And then please also know that you can share and ask any questions during this program. I'm sure Bruce will mention that as well. There is a button on the bottom of your screen where you can just tap in on chat and ask your questions that way. So again, thank you for joining us this morning, and it is my pleasure to introduce Bruce Nustad with the Minnesota Retailers Association. Bruce.
Well, thanks, Kristi. Hey, by the way, great group this morning. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, we really miss in-person meetings, but I guess this is the next best thing. So looking forward to having a conversation today about retail and small business and opening and some of the ins and outs and caveats surrounding that. So again, thank you, Kristi. Actually, I was remembering this morning my first real exposure to your organization. And I think it could have been 2016, 17, or 18, but I'm just remembering around the holidays, the council did this really neat pop-up program right around the holidays that I was super impressed by. And I know I knew about you before that, but that really, I just thought that was unique and innovative. So thanks for all the work that the council does and all the work that all the retailers do in Duluth there. We know right now is an extremely difficult time. We know it feels like a time where there isn't a lot of fairness in the marketplace either. I think all of us wish we weren't in the spot that we are relative to pandemic. We've been working with the governor and his staff here in Minnesota for the last few weeks. As you probably noted, we were able to get Curbside open a week ago, which was great, but we also know that Curbside is not the same as having customers in your store in a safe way. So I guess the plan today is to just share, well, I would say maybe 20 minutes of a presentation with you, just to get you up to speed as to where we think things are and what you might expect. But you know, the real power in these pieces is really just the conversation that we can have. So please do share thoughts, comments, feedback, concern, those types of things that you have as we're going through things today. And then we'll have lots of time on the back end too. As Kristi said, some of you submitted questions. We'll try to go through all of those, and it'll be great to hear an update from the city. It's just so meaningful to see not only retailers and organizations like the Downtown Council and the city pull together in this time to figure out what's working best for small businesses and retailers, and how can we make a bad situation better. So I'm going to get into, if that sounds okay, a quick introduction on the screen. Also, Savannah Sepik is my colleague here at the Retail Association. Savannah, feel free to chime in at any point as well. Great to have you on. I'm going to start with like the giant disclosure, and this is it's not political, but I'll just say this organization, the one that I work for, the Minnesota Retailers, we really believe that public health and economic health can be balanced. And those two things can be done in tandem. So quite frankly, we don't want to see anything done economically that puts a challenge on us from a public health perspective. We also don't want to see anything from a public health perspective that unnecessarily provides economic damage. So we're probably, like most of you, very pragmatic. You want to see things opened up. You want to see things operate in a little bit more fair capacity at the retail level, but you also want to make sure your fellow Minnesotans are safe and customers feel comfortable coming to your business or your store as well. So that's my great disclosure for today. I am going to share slides with you here. Give me just a second. And like I said, we'll go through a few slides and then we will come back to questions and answers. Good. So hopefully everybody right now can see a slide that says critical next steps to reopen, curbside retail and beyond. So again, my organization is called the Minnesota Retailers Association. We're a collection of retailers across the state, about 1,200 storefronts. About a third of our members are small Main Street retailers, usually one store, maybe two, but usually one store. About a third are what we call mid-sized retailers, because quite frankly, we're not quite sure what else to call them. And those are retailers that have multiple stores. You maybe even have a store in a couple different states. And then we work with some of the national brands too. So the magic, quite frankly, in our model is that we've kind of got all three segments of sizes. And quite frankly, all retailers in Minnesota depend on each other. And it's what makes our model work. So we appreciate the opportunity to work with innovative retailers across the state. Let's just start out real quick with kind of where are we now and how are decisions being made. And you've probably seen these next three slides as I go through them. They are the governor's slides, and I just want to touch on them just so you have a sense for how decisions are being made, and know that in a moment we're going to get to what's coming up next. But I just want to kind of frame it up just for a moment from how decisions are made. So the governor's trying to balance public health, social distancing, and societal well-being. So societal well-being is sort of where the economy fits into that. Social distancing obviously is a key strategy in managing the pandemic and building hospital capacity, et cetera. And then of course, public health is an important aspect as well. So for the governor and for all of us, where things kind of meet in the middle there is where Minnesota hits, and there's an effort to make decisions on his part. Again, I'm not the governor. I don't actually work for the governor. I'm like you. I'm just a resident and citizen of Minnesota. But as I understand it, you know, his decision-making model really tries to balance all three of these things. You have probably seen this too. This is an approach that the governor and his staff developed a couple of weeks ago to better explain not necessarily the decision-making process, but what's next. So on the left-hand side there is where we'll focus. You'll see workplace settings. A couple weeks ago, the governor took some steps to open up some office settings, some industrial settings, some manufacturing under social distancing standards. You'll see the curbside piece. We worked actively with the governor's office on that to at least get some revenue flowing to some of your stores via curbside. Again, we know curbside is not perfect. It doesn't work perfect. It's not the solution, but hopefully if you're able to do curbside, you've been able to generate a couple dollars here and there to get a few dollars flowing into business. And then next on the dial is what he labels as single shops. So that is in essence an opening of stores to in-store customers under strong social distancing standards. And we're going to talk pretty deep about that in just a few minutes. But know, for those of you on the Zoom today, the next turn of the dial is opening your store to customers with still a good strong preference to curbside and appointments. But the idea would be that you'd be able to let folks back in your store and resume things a little bit more normally than you can now. We know, by the way, for retail's an experience. We know, well, curbside is good and online ordering is good. You know, customers really like to be able to talk to you and your employees and make decisions about products that they can look, feel, and touch. So next on the dial, we should be pretty close. Now on this, you're going to see malls to the far right. We actually think the governor's thinking of malls a little closer to that single shop dial. So the dial might have changed a little bit, but then we get to less predictable and large size settings. So just from a how retail positions itself, I think it's important that everybody know the message that we have tried to deliver to the governor is that we think stores can be open under social distancing in a safe way. And I think his concern is predictability. And I think we have told is that you on the Zoom today and others can actually do a good job adding predictability to your shops and stores and small businesses. So I think that message has resonated. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute as well. You may have seen this slide. This is the governor used this a couple weeks ago when we were at a press conference with him on the curbside piece, and it just sort of charts what's happened and what's going to happen moving forward. So the blue dot on here was actually the curbside announcement. The one below that is revised executive order on surgeries that actually hit last week. So that dot could be filled in. So really in the governor's plan, the next step is actually open additional customer facing business. So we think we're getting close to that announcement, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments, but just so you kind of know where things fall in the continuum there. And then let's go ahead and get into, I guess maybe just a quick pause. Any just quick questions on kind of how we think the governor is processing his options? Okay. So where are we going and when? So I won't get too deep into it, but oh boy, Savannah, what, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, our organization put together what we called the Critical Next Steps Plan. We realized if there wasn't sort of a plan that said, how do we get back to the new normal, it makes it a little bit more difficult to get there. So we put together the plan you see on your screen. I'm not going to go into each piece. Here's another way of looking at it, but basically it provided for, here's an immediate phase, and you can see of the 3 things on the screen there, one of those is done. We wanted to see kind of a phase 2 to the Paycheck Protection Program. The other 2 we're actually still working on in earnest. We've kind of gotten through the short-term phase 2, as you'll see there, and that was curbside, like we talked about, and testing. Testing super important relative to establishing a new norm. And now we're on to phase 3, the midterm, which again is reopening stores to customers under social distancing best practices, and then eventually hoping to get to a little less restrictive piece. But quite frankly, long-term is probably a ways out for us. So we're working hard on the midterm right now, and that's getting stores open. So we want to talk a little bit about what you can do to prepare. And I think what we're going to try to give you is kind of 4 different perspectives today. And we'll try to do that in the next 15 minutes, so we have plenty of time for conversation. So 4 different perspectives. 3 of them are sort of maybe approaches you could take to putting in place what a plan might look like for being reopened. And the last one is based on some guidance that we recently provided the governor. We'll probably spend a little bit more time on that because I think it'll give you some insight into what the operating rules might be like for retailers and small businesses as you open up. But having said that, the great thing about today and last week and next week is there are a lot of organizations that are trying to amass what we call best practice information. So best practices would be a collection of do's and don'ts and considerations relative to how you might operate your small business or retail operation going forward. And of course, your downtown council is a great spot, a great source for information. I know the organization has done a great job on COVID-19. So keep up the good work there, but just a fantastic spot relative to where you can get some good best practice information. You can certainly look to the Retailers Association for information. We know the Minnesota Chamber and the U.S. Chamber have some good information out there. We work a lot with the National Retail Federation and the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Both of them have kind of reopened playbooks on their website. So I think the good news is there's plenty of information to draw from. I think today what we want to do is just provide you a little bit of a framework as to how you might be filtering that information here for Minnesota. So just a quick glance, if you go to our website, there are some buckets there. We've got some best practices for curbside and delivery. We've got some best practices for having customers back in your store, a little link for our plan. And also what we do there is we provide, a near daily update on things that happened, usually on the Minnesota level that we think will interest folks as well. So it's a great spot just to take a quick peek at every day to see if there are any updates. In addition, we've got a best practices document out on our website. It's up on your screen right now, simply labeled store best practices for social distancing. There's a dozen items there, and we'll talk through those a little deeper as well. Okay, so let's spend a few minutes just talking about some work that we have done recently, working with local chambers of commerce and working with retailers and other business associations. I guess about a week ago, if I'm remembering right, the deed commissioner, who has had a kind of a stakeholders group called the Deed Retail Roundtable, where we've had a conversation every week kind of about what's going on in retail and what reopening might look like. Last week, the deed commissioner said, hey, can this group actually kind of put together a plan for what reopening might look like now that we got curbside done? So, of course, the group was enthusiastic to do that, as you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear. And in the end, what we ended up submitting to the deed commissioner is really a plan that consists of, quite simply, 3 requirements to open a customer-facing business, and then a bunch of best practices that should be considered. So from a process standpoint, we think the deed commissioners shared this with the governor, and they're having conversations. We hope the result of this draft plan that we put together will be some opening of retailers, hopefully beginning next week. I think if you were to crystal ball this, you might think that maybe tomorrow's a good day for an announcement on the plan and other areas of retail, including restaurants and salons. And then you might see some loosening maybe this coming Monday. That's just crystal ball. Could be wrong on that. But I think the governor has told us and a lot of other folks that relative to retail reopenings, to think about it in terms of days, not weeks. So I think that's important as you sort of think about what you might be doing in the next couple days relative to reopening and considering how you might reopen in a safe manner. So just taking one step up before we go into these requirements, one of the things that the governor has done with all the industries that he reopens is he's required what's been called a COVID-19 preparedness plan. So we shorten that up, we just call it a safety plan. And there is a document out on the Department of Labor and Industry website. We can get that URL for you. And it's a template. So when you think about not this past Monday, when you think about the Monday where office settings and industrial settings were able to be reopened, one of the pieces that those reopening businesses had to do was put together a COVID-19 preparedness plan. Again, short-term safety plan. And so we think the governor will require that of all industries that are opening over the next few weeks. So I think if you're writing down kind of your list of to-dos today, the first thing you can put on your list is safety plan, because we're pretty convinced you're going to have a safety plan. In that safety plan, or in those requirements to reopen, we have recommended to the governor these 3 items on your screen. And that is, you must have a safety plan. So again, there's a template out there. You can fill in your information on top of the template. Makes it a pretty great place to start. But number one, we're pretty sure one of your requirements to reopen a retail store or a small business is going to be you're going to have a safety plan, a written safety plan. That plan should include best practices. So we're going to talk through those in a couple minutes. But that's the customization of the plan. That's the part of the plan that says, hey, you know what? I'm going to ask my employees to wear face coverings if that's something you're going to do. Or I'm going to mark off some 6-foot increments at my point of sale area, checkout area, so that people can be reminded of social distancing. So that's the best practices part that should be included in the plan. And then the third part that we suggested, just because everywhere else is doing it, is that you should contemplate occupancy. So we've seen other states do different things. I'm trying to remember, I think maybe Indiana right now has restaurants open or opening to 25% occupancy, things like that. We think retailers should contemplate their occupancy. Now that's a probably not surprising thing to be asked relative to the social distancing. So we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But again, if you're making a list, I think drafting your safety plan is good to be on the list. And keep in mind, you're going to want to pull best practices into that safety plan and think about your occupancy. So those would be the 3 things that we've recommended as the requirements to reopen. On the best practices side, so let me rephrase that. The requirements are really the musts. You must have a safety plan. You should think about best practices and including them in your safety plan, and you should contemplate occupancy. Those are the musts. Those are the things you have to do to reopen. Under the plan in the social distancing area, we've put together a pretty robust list of best practices that we think are smart for retailers. But let me take a pause and say our intention is that those best practices be a collection of shoulds and not musts, meaning each environment in retail is different, as you well know, and in small businesses. And I think the full expectation should be that you modify those best practices based on your setting. So as an example, we have a lot of Main Street retailers say, you know what, I never actually have a full store of 20 people here bumping into each other. Well, great. That means your look at social distancing and your spacing between customers and occupancy is going to be different than a different store and can be managed differently and probably should have a different standard. So in our mind, you really end up with the ability to contemplate how your store works, what's going to be the most comfortable for your employees and your customers. But again, with a set of best practices that you can modify. So we have lumped those best practice areas into 4 different categories: health and wellness, social distancing, cleaning, sanitation, protection, and operations and communications. So I'll give you maybe just a couple examples out of each of those categories. So like in health and wellness, our document would say, hey, you know what, you should really evaluate your employee health. If they're not really feeling well, they shouldn't come to work. I mean, that's common sense, but that's a basic health and wellness thing. On the converse side, a sign that says to customers, hey, if you're not feeling well today, we'd ask that you come back and shop another day out of courtesy to other customers. That's the customer wellness side. So that's just a quick peek into the health and wellness area. On social distancing, that's where we talk a little bit more about what does the store look like? You know, if there's markings on the floor to mark out 6 feet, you know, how do you do that? I know I've said this and it makes people laugh, but I think blue painter's tape is going to become a retailer's best friend in the short term. I know there's a lot of great printers in Duluth, by the way. Certainly go find a professional printer to make your signs and your floor distancing look really, really great. In the meantime, if you want to test it out, get out the old blue painter's tape. And I'll tell you what, consumers today know exactly what those lines on the floor mean. So give it a test and see how it works. In the cleaning, sanitation, and protection, nothing really surprising there. That's all about making sure your environment is clean as it can be. I think we get into a few caveats if you have a store where you've got a fitting room or you take back returns, and we can talk about that if anybody wants to, what the best practices might be there, but there are some considerations there. And then just operations and communications. That relates mostly to how you're talking to your employees, if you have them, and your customers, and some items in that bucket. So again, I think our high level takeaway is you're going to have a plan. The plan's probably going to have a few musts, and under those musts are going to be the shoulds, which are should address some best practices, put some best practices in place, and they probably all fall into these categories. Okay, I'm going to zip through just a few other pieces here. And this is more about how you might draft your plan. So you've got the plan, you've got a template, you've got a list of best practices. Those are all good and important pieces. But we think there's probably 3 different ways you could think about what goes into your plan. The first way is just to consider your customer, your employees, and perception. And in this, like this would be taking a step back and saying to yourself, okay, I've got loyal customers, I've got returning customers, but I also have customers who've never been here before. And you want to draft your safety plan to customers that have never been there before. It's really easy to think, well, Jim comes to the store all the time. He's going to come back. He's going to be comfortable. I don't really have to worry about a lot of the stuff because that customer is going to be comfortable. They know I take good care of things and I'll take great care of them. That's good. But really, you're going to want to draft your plan to your customer that's never walked into your store before. So that's one of your filters. Same with employees. A lot of retailers are drafting plans and thinking in terms of, well, you know, Sally's worked here for 20 years. She knows the ins and outs. She knows we're not going to take on any unnecessary risks. That's great. But you should really address your plan to an employee that's never worked there before and just run it through that framework. What do we do here that a new customer would like to see done differently under kind of the pandemic circumstances, or a new employee would like to see done differently? And if you just think about it from that perspective, you're going to actually come up with a dozen things that make sense to do to protect your customers and put kind of the right safety plan forward. As part of that, again, sometimes you can look at what might a regulator want to see. but more so what's the public perception of what I'm doing here. So again, that's just one way you can kind of reorient your mind to draft your safety plan. What's good for a new customer, what's good for a new employee. Second way to do that, and this is quite frankly kind of my favorite because I think well, part of it is Bruce Nustad, so you all know, is a kind of linear thinker. I think in lines, I'm not a good outside the box thinker, but I'm a good linear thinker. So I like this because I think it's a process to put your safety plan in place and the new way of operating that is really easy. And it all centers around this word contactless, so without contact. So what I would do if I had a store is I would take a blank sheet of paper. I would write the word no contact or contactless on the top. On the left side of the piece of paper, I would write the way I did things before COVID-19. So I would write, relative to how a customer pays, I would say I accept cash, check, or credit card. And then I would run that through on the right-hand side of my page, how I might do that different in a contactless perspective. So, I might not accept cash, or if I accept cash, I might wear gloves. Or I've got a credit card reader. Usually I grab the credit card and I swipe the credit card for the customer because it's a lot faster. I might think about moving that terminal out so the customer can do it on their own. So it's just really about taking everything you did pre-pandemic and running it through, how could I do this with less contact? And I think then you end up with a piece of paper where you've kind of mapped on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side, where the left-hand side is everything you normally do, right-hand side is how you do that in a more contactless perspective. Now we know there can't, if you've got a shoe store, you're doing shoe fittings, there's going to be some contact there. But even at that, you can look at contactless and say, okay, well, how do I space my customers out? How do I have everybody touch fewer shoes? Instead of bringing out 3 different sizes, maybe I bring out 2. You just think about it from a contactless perspective. And that forces you to think about your physical space. It forces you to sort of think about, okay, what is my least comfortable customer going to expect out of me? And then how am I talking about that and including that into my marketing? So we think that's again, another way to help draft your safety plan. And then the final, there are some retailers, as you well know, that have been open throughout the pandemic. We've actually put together a lot of our best practices based on what those retailers have learned during the pandemic. Target actually has a 61-page document complete with examples and templates and all kinds of really interesting information that you can take a look at. They call it their Safe Retail Framework, SAFE. S stands for what are you doing in the screening area. A is for access. That's all about the physical space in the store. F is relative to face coverings, and then E, essential security safety measures, which is cleaning and those types of things. So that is a document that we have available on our website under best practices, just to click straight through to that. Nice thing about that is there are some signs in there where they've taken the Target information off. So if you want a sign that says on your door that says, hey, we'd really appreciate it if you shop today, if you're only feeling well, they've got some language there that you can pull from. You could even use that sign if you want to. But that's a nice framework as well. So we can certainly make that available as well. So that's, again, a third way of putting together your plan is simply looking at what does somebody else's plan look like and how can I make modifications to that. Okay. So I think that gets us to the part where earlier I mentioned how grateful we are to have strong retail partners, strong partner in the Downtown Council and Chambers of Commerce. And we know cities, quite frankly, are taking steps to really help their retailers. One of those areas we've talked about is curbside, and what can a city do to help businesses that are dependent on curbside right now have a little bit more accessibility for their customers, et cetera. So Kristi, I think this is a great spot to take a pause and have you introduce your guest from the city.
Sure. Thanks so much, Bruce. And I know that there were some questions that came in during this time period, so that might give you an opportunity to take a quick look at those. Chris Fleege is the Director of Planning and Economic Development for the city. So Chris, thanks for joining us. Great timing on this because the city really move quickly in trying to get something before the city council. And so last night the council approved a resolution. I'll have Chris share a little bit more about that and then what that means for all of you as retailers and restaurants and breweries and that type. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Kristi. Yeah, so I saw that Councilor Kennedy is on as well, and obviously she sits on the council, but the resolution that passed last night and that was adopted really was intended to help facilitate the curbside effort, both curbside and also to provide the special use sidewalk permits. And really what we're doing on the city side is really setting up a group so that we can expedite those. We're waiving our fees for those at this point, from now until the end of the year. And then working with parking as well. By ordinance, different groups have to process it, but we're going to have all the permits rolled down through the planning group. So we'll set up a page that will launch. I mean, obviously the resolution was passed last night, but I mean, it'll help facilitate both the curbside pickup to provide parklets. And then if there's certain signage that we want to go to, and I know Kristi, we had talked a little bit about that. Do we want to have a standard sign? I mean, there's different options, and the city is very open to creating a common type sign. For restaurants that are clustered close together, you may want to look at sharing a curbside area. So the city would work with you on that as well. So there's a parklet permit, there's a sidewalk use permit. So you still have to fill out the paperwork, but we'll move those through as quickly as possible. So and we did talk with the city clerk, and for those that are restaurants and want to expand their liquor license, there is a way. They're looking. They're not waiving their fees. It's a one-time fee. I think it's $119. They had some strange language in there that said it can only be 50% of your existing square footage, and they're gonna amend those that language to create more space for restaurants to have more social distancing. So again, the intent of this is really from now until the end of the year to really provide better access to restaurants and retailers really across the city. So anywhere that there's a commercial area, you can apply for these sidewalk permits, and there'd be no fees for us to process those. And like I said, we're gearing up in planning. So right now, those applications are on the website. So I mean, you can get to them if you go down in through the city webpage, and you get down into the planning and parking area. That's where those permits are. So, and we know that it doesn't work for all businesses. So, but for those that can leverage it or would like to have something set up, we're more than happy to do that. And yeah, so here to answer any questions. I know Kristi sent me a lot of them. I thought Bruce did a great job talking about how really a lot of those, some of those questions were around like square footage. Is the city going to be more restrictive? And again, we're going to follow the state guidelines because it is evolving. And to Bruce's point, it is relaxing and it's changing. So, the city intends to follow whatever the state rules are. We're not going to be more restrictive than that. And we do want to provide businesses the opportunity to innovate. So we are looking forward to working with businesses as they come up with different concepts as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And I know the Greater Downtown Council is working to help put together some additional signage that could be uniform so that everybody would have the same type of signage. So we're happy to work with you on that too, and to keep the process moving ahead. I don't know if this is anything that you can answer right now, but there was a question about the typical barriers that might be needed on sidewalks. Has there been any conversation at the city level about that yet?
Yeah, so I did talk with Director Helmer, and she said that would not be relaxed, that there'll still need to be some barrier. Where they're really looking at is that square footage piece, and there's some other language that they're trying to relax, but we'll still need to maintain some type of a barrier. Now I think you could propose some different things. Maybe it's been more restrictive in the past, but there'll need to be some type of a barrier so that it's not just freewheeling. So that may restrict some folks. But again, the idea is, if you've got an innovative idea or something you want to float, we'll try to process it very quickly. And again, the clerk's office is gearing up, so hopefully it'll feel like a one-stop shop, even though it has to go to parking and has to go to the clerk's office and through planning. But we'll try to streamline that so that to you, as you're filling it out, we can get you answers fairly quickly. So yeah, unfortunately, that was a question that they are not, they don't see that modifying, that requirement to have some type of a barrier will be important for the folks that have the liquor license, and want to have expanded service for that. Now the governor's order did allow for curbside pickup for beer and wine, and we didn't need to make any other changes to our policy. But again, that's only for beer and wine, and that was done by the by the legislature, and the city is obviously supportive of that for restaurants.
And just to reiterate what you had mentioned about the barrier, that is mainly for restaurants that would have liquor, right?
Liquor.
So it's not for a retailer. So
not for retailers at all. Yep, no problem with that. It would be like sidewalk sales. You just need the the sidewalk permit, special use permit, which we're waiving and just processing. So yeah.
That will really help them out. Thank you so much, Chris. I don't see any specific questions that came up right now for him. Bruce, do you want to take on some more of the additional questions right now, and we'll see what else maybe comes up for the city too. Thanks.
That sounds great. Thanks, Kristi, and just Chris and Councilor Kennedy. I just thank you so much. I know you know how important it is to have some flexibility and work with your retailers, and just appreciate that so much. So a really couple good questions here. So somebody asked about kind of where things are from a salon perspective, haircuts, yoga studios, gyms. So I'll give you what our sense is on timing on that. If I had to, again, crystal ball it, so take this for what it's worth, I would say on likely tomorrow, we're likely to see some announcements on retail, like I mentioned, that would reopen stores under best practices to customers. I think part of that announcement will be an announcement surrounding restaurants and bars. I think that announcement may not kick in on Monday, but it may be another week or two, just a guess. And I think it will look heavily at occupancy. Chris mentioned it, from a occupancy perspective, it might be a scenario where, your occupancy might be 20, 25%, maybe it's 50, whatever the number might be, just enough to encourage that social distancing. So I wouldn't be too surprised if we saw restaurants and bars not too far behind the opening of other retail. And then close in concert to that, I think we'll see hair care, spas, salons, open as well. Again, if I had to crystal ball that, I would guess before the end of the month. But again, I haven't seen the plans there. We don't really have the liberty to look at those. So we'll try to get a better sense for that. But I think probably, hopefully before June on those. And I do sort of think that gyms, spas, salons will kind of be all grouped together in some type of announcement, because I think for the governor, the things that he's going to want to see relative to the protections for consumers and employees are going to be very, very similar. So that's my best guess there. Somebody asked about fitting rooms and return merchandise. So in our best practices document, what you'll see in there is a strong encouragement that when you're doing fittings, you just include some best practice principles. So I'll use the shoe store as an example. If you used to allow customers to sit right next to each other during a shoe fitting, you'd want to maintain some social distance between those customers. You'd want to make sure you are offering some protection, again, on a should perspective to your employees. So that might be gloves and a mask in a close quarter setting like that. So common sense things that you'd probably see. Fitting rooms, I think Our suggestion would be that fitting rooms are okay to use, that you ask customers, instead of bringing an item in there in 3 different sizes, you're going to want to think about how you return things to your store shelf. So you may say to a customer, you know what, we're just allowing 1 item per fitting room per trip right now. And that would encourage your customer to take their best guess at a size. And instead of bringing 3 sizes in, and in theory, you end up with 2 articles of clothing that you have to decide when you can return to your shelf, you can hopefully narrow it down so you only end up with 1 or possibly none. So I think you're going to want some of those common sense changes to kind of your fitting room policy. You're going to want to probably do some, from a consumer confidence perspective, you're going to probably want to do some cleaning between customers using your fitting room, and probably cleaning of high touch surfaces. So doorknobs, racks that are cleanable, those types of things. So just again, common sense relative to a cleaning between customers. And again, what you really want to do is make sure your customers and your employees feel comfortable with your operation, run it through that filter. From a return merchandise perspective, I think we have seen some retailers operating during the pandemic so far not accept return merchandise. I think that'll be up to each retailer. A lot of times folks will say to us, well, if there's something that I can clean, you sell puzzles, the puzzles in a plastic shrink wrap, and you can simply run a disinfectant over that. You can really return that to your shelf with a high degree of confidence in a pretty short period of time. The science on fabrics and COVID-19 and other germs isn't necessarily well developed yet. We recommend, again, as a recommendation, that folks think about kind of holding a product that's been tried on by a customer in a back room for 24 to 48 hours. Again, think about that, not in terms of what is the science support, but what is a customer going to expect. Customer walks in your store, they're going to buy a t-shirt, they're going to assume that t-shirt is as safe as possible. So I think you want to think about, for some of those fabrics or products that you can't clean, some type of hold policy. Again, it'll be, in our mind, individual to each store, but that's just something to consider. So that's sort of our fitting rooms and returns type thoughts. The other thing on that is, like all things, you'll want to clearly communicate what your return merchandise policy is if it's changed, but you'll want to fairly clearly communicate that to customers as well. Just looking through, I think some of the questions, Kristi, that were sent in advance. I think we covered, like you said, barriers and serving of alcohol. I think somebody asked about plexiglass shields. Again, our recommendation is that our recommendation is between checkout and a customer is that you try to maintain some semblance of social distancing. And if you can't do that, then you provide some best practices that might relate to face coverings or plexiglass shielding. We know that customers are actually become very comfortable with plexiglass shielding as an example, so it's not bad to think about those things. But again, from our perspective in a plan, you would really just make that decision as to what works best for your employee and the customer and provides the most confidence in that transaction. So that may be plexiglass shielding, it may be a face covering, whatever might make sense. It may be both for some of you, who knows, whatever makes the most sense for you and your customer. And the other question I think that we got in advance, which is a really good one, is related, and I think we covered, is like how many people per square foot. And I will say our recommendation on that is that there is not a magic formula. Our recommendation is that each of you in your own store or small business are going to make the best decision on that without somebody telling you what to do. The problem with someone saying, like we toyed with 50% of everybody's got an occupancy permit. It'd be easy to go look in the back room at the occupancy permit and say, well, I'm rated for 25 people in this store, so I can do 12. That'd be great, but really it depends on how your store is laid out, the flow of your store, those types of things. So really what you want to do is make a good decision based on what provides an element of that social distancing for your customers and your employees. So we do in our documents say, you know what, think about 50%. We do that because that's a really easy number to figure out. Just about everybody can find their occupancy number really, really quick. So it's a really easy number to figure out, but we say defer really to what provides the right amount of space between customers that will make everybody the most comfortable. So again, a little bit of a guideline, but like most of these things, there's a best practice, something for you to consider, but really make the best decision for your customers and your employees. And I know we talked about curbside a little bit, but I know we're right up against 10:15, but I'd love to take just a couple minutes to see if there's any other comments or questions. Yes, can you repeat where to find the safety plan format? So what we'll do is, actually, I think our draft plan is not up on our website yet, but I think we feel comfortable putting that out there. So at mnretail.org/COVID-19, we'll make sure we put that out there. Like the target safety plan sample is out there, et cetera. So we'll make sure we put our draft plan out there right when we're done with this so you can take a look at it.
And Bruce, I will mention, there was a request about, will this webinar be shareable? So I know you are recording it, so we could share that link and then also share the link to some of the safety plan information and stuff afterwards. So I do recall, I think there was a question, I don't know if you touched on it too much ahead of time, but more about the back of house best practices. So for the employees who are in the back or dealing with just breaks and different things like that.
Yeah. So two things to think about there, and I'm glad you actually mentioned that, Kristi, because we didn't really get too deep into it. The issue of face coverings and gloves. And I think our best practice is follow the state of Minnesota recommendation on face coverings. So right now, the governor's recommendation in his latest executive order, I think the 2048, says, I strongly encourage Minnesotans to wear face coverings. So we think deferring to that guidance is sort of a good baseline. And if you choose to do something more stringent than that, that makes sense too. But what made me think that, Kristi, is your question on kind of back of house where you see some movement and, you tend to get people a little closer together. I think our two pieces there are, consider PPE for back of house, consider face coverings as an example, consider gloves, consider those types of things. When you can reconfigure space to try to provide a little bit more room for each employee, and that's really important, but you also have to recognize that you can't always win on 6 feet. Sometimes you do get people a little closer together, and that's where you want to make sure you're taking some steps to protect your folks. So face coverings is a great example. But again, my second point was going to be just reconfiguring your space to the best that you can. If you had 2 employees that stood next to each other performing a function, figure out how they can do it, if you can, standing across from each other with a little more space or a little more distance between those employees. But that again is, a good thing to take a piece of paper and have, what do we currently do right now? Where does that not provide for some social distancing? And how do we reconfigure that to make that happen with more social distancing and more protection for the employees?
Thanks. Any tips for businesses offering classes?
Yep. 2 things there as well. And I guess this is sort of if you've got a gym or a spa to think about as well. You're going to want to think about spacing and heavily focus your efforts on spacing first and foremost. So if you've got a business that offers a class, you usually have people sit in rows, classroom styles at tables. You're going to want to think about, instead of 2 chairs next to each other, pulling a chair out so that you have some space between each of those chairs and you have some adequate space between your rows as well. So again, that's back to kind of how do you reconfigure your space to allow as much social distancing as possible. So that feels somewhat doable in the case of a business class. I think it gets a little bit more tricky when you're talking about a gym setting and perspiration and those types of things. That's probably going to be the case where you're going to want to exceed social distancing standards relative to space. So you've got a yoga studio, 6 feet, might not be the right number in a yoga studio. You're going to really want to think about what's the maximum amount of space that I can provide between my customers, where somebody would walk in the room and look at this and say, hey, you know what, they've done a good job making sure there's some protections here for their folks. So a couple different ways of looking at that. It's a good question though.
So what about like art classes? So they have to be thinking about even the product that they provide people to do
Right.
art classes.
Right. And the key there, I think, is, it doesn't matter if it's a paintbrush or a point of sale system. You're going to want to think about what's your disinfecting routine. So let's say you're doing an art class and you're doing a demonstration. You've got 5 people in a room. They've got good social distance around them. They wrap up, they leave. You've got some product left. You've got some paintbrushes left. Those are the things you're going to want to focus in your safety plan on your disinfecting protocol. How do I disinfect those so that the next person can use them and feel comfortable with them? So again, you kind of got spacing, you've got PPE or face coverings, and you've got disinfecting, all of those kind of coming into play there. And I should say too, I think we keep saying masks and face masks. We love to use the word face coverings because that's actually what the governor uses as well. And really the trick in a face covering is it doesn't have to be a medical grade face covering. Some of the most creative business things I've seen is I've seen a retailer that ran down to their local screen printer and said, hey, can you print my logo on a bunch of bandanas? Bandanas are inexpensive, but I'll have my logo on there, and that's what I'll offer to my customers if they walk in and they don't have a face covering and I would like them to. So have some of those options, but be creative about it too, available to consumers.
And then I know you touched on this briefly, but I think it's still a little unclear. So it was said where the massage studios fall. I don't know if you're able to answer that or not. Do you know, do they fall the same as hair salons?
Again, this is just we haven't done a lot of work in that area, but here's what my gut tells me, that the governor's probably looking to how things happen in a chiropractor setting and trying to figure out how you apply those things to a hair care or massage setting. So, I mean, I think we've got some great examples from a healthcare perspective of how you can interact with people in the safest way possible. And I think those will be applied to those types of settings. So if I was a hair salon, again, I would think about what do I do if I'm not going to move chairs around. I saw a real creative thing with inexpensive shower curtains the other day. I saw a hair salon that posted a video, and what they did is they put up plastic or rubberized shower curtains between their chairs. And the idea is there that you're just, again, hopefully there's some space, but also there's a protective barrier. And I know sometimes these things feel like maybe they're overkill, but you really, again, have to think about in terms of what's going to make people comfortable. So I like that salon put up this shower curtain as a protective barrier between its chairs, because there's some sensibility to that. But so back to the question, I think we'll see some movement for hair care, spas, massage, tanning, those types. I think my gut tells me we'll see some movement on those somewhere around the end of the month, maybe before, and that the pieces there will center around protective equipment for both the person performing the service and the person receiving the service, and a recognition that there will be contact there, but there are ways to at least reduce the risk in that contact.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, and I wish I had more insight on bars, restaurants, bowling alleys, movie theaters, hair care salons, but that's my best gut right now, is that we'll see some movement in there. The movements will be generally based on reducing occupancy and ensuring that there's some proper space between folks.
And I know before this session, we also had a question about any of the businesses that might be in our construction zone. So Superior Street is under construction, and how to work with curbside service and things like that. For anybody who is in the construction zone, I would just ask that you probably reach out to us individually, and we can work with you one-on-one that way between the city and Northland Constructors and the GDC, trying to see what we can do to assist you that way. And I see Chris shaking his head too, so thank you. I think that might be all of the questions that we have. I will allow maybe Chris to say any parting thoughts that you might have, just to share for folks as well.
No, just that, the city's here for you. We know this is a difficult time. I mean, it's just, mean, unprecedented. So anything we can do to try to help you through this period, you know, our team is ready to do, and we're dealing with our own crisis. We got a number of people laid off, and it's going to be tough sledding for a long time here. So, but anyways, we're here to help, and we've got the group that's geared up to help with the curbside, because I do think that's a nice first step before the reopening gets rolling here. So, yeah.
Great. And then for people, again, with the curbside, we know that there will be more people starting to park on the streets. The downtown is pretty full of cars right now on the street. So we are working with the city in identifying some, whether it's meters or parking spaces, where we can put some universal signs there that would allow folks to know that that is a short term for curbside pickup and delivery. So thank you for that, Chris, and everyone at the City of Duluth. Bruce, any parting thoughts that you'd like to share? It has been great to get your insight today and everything that you've shared from best practices and things that we'll be able to continue to share with folks.
Yeah, and again, thanks, Kristi, for the opportunity, and to all of you. I know you're anxious to be able to do more with your customers. I hope we're getting there closely and soon. And thanks so much for your patience. I know it is extremely difficult. Anything we can do here at the association to help out, let us know. We love ideas. You know, we have seen communities that are thinking about establishing kind of safe shopping zones and kind of unifying the community around safe shopping messages. Just any stories that you have or thoughts, we'd love to have them here as well. I'm going to actually turn off the recording right now, and Savannah and I can hang on the Zoom for a while if anybody wants to talk about any individual issues or just share any thoughts that you might have. But again, thanks, Kristi, for allowing us to be with you today.
And I do want to share that there have been some